controversy of censorship has been brought up ever since the freedom of speech was introduced to the Constitution. People have protested, rioted, and died to protect freedoms such as this, but the value of this freedom varies from person to person. As the popularity of the inventions of movies, radio, and television broadcasting began to increase during the beginning of the 20th century, the debate over regulation of these things has grown into one of the biggest issues in the world today. Movies became the big source of entertainment at the turn of the century. The whole vaudeville slapstick comedy thing was big, but most people don't know that a lot of movies had excessive amounts of violence, drug use, and sex because at the time there were no laws to regulate it. One of the more popular entertainers of the early 1900s was Charlie Chaplin. Whether or not films were protected by the First Amendment was decided in 1915 in the case Mutual v. Ohio, when the Supreme Court ruled that movies were business, not art, and thus had no constitutional protection.
With the creation of the Motion Picture Association of America in 1922, very strict laws and codes were put in place to regulate the airwaves. However, it wasn't even until 5 years later when the first talkie came out.
Talkies, or films with sound, were introduced with the release of the film The Jazz Singer in 1927. This was a milestone in cinema history because all movies previously had been silent films. Even though movies weren't protected by the freedom of speech, the Supreme Court ruling that declared that was actually overturned in 1952.
The MPAA's codes were not strictly enforced until the current codes that exist today were put in place in 1967. It's been in control of the movie industry ever since.
As the century rolled into the 1950s, Senator Joe McCarthy became the leader of the angry mob against communism. America had been experiencing tension with the Soviet Union and was very afraid of the spread of communism. Many entertainers of the time period were blacklisted, including Lucille Ball and Pete Seeger. Not only was Seeger believed to be a communist, but he was also sentenced to a year in jail. The sentence, however, was soon appealed, and Seeger was a free man.
Even though McCarthyism technically ended in the 1950s, the FBI still kept a close watch on people like myself and Phil Oakes during the Cold War and the Cuban Missile Crisis. In the 1980s, the censorship of music became extremely overwhelming after heavy metal became popular. In the 1980s, I heard a song called Suicide, and supposedly it urges two kids to commit suicide, and their parents and the government were blaming it on me, and they started these organizations against rock music and heavy metal music because they didn't like the influence it was having on the children. But if they don't want the children to listen to the songs, then they should let them. You know, it's up to the parents to decide what their children can listen to. You know, just make it so the children don't buy the music, you know. It's not my fault. You know, I'm a musician, I'm just expressing myself. But it's not up to me whether your child buys the music or not. You know, it's not my fault. Sharon!
Censorship not only affects Americans, but people in other countries as well. Because the freedoms Americans have do not exist in all countries, the battle with censorship is tougher. Regardless of this, countries like Iran and Israel have produced many cinema successes in recent years.